Well,
speaking of people.
That's right. Speaking of people, a recent study from the Georgia Institute of Technology indicates that contrary to earlier research, men and women don't communicate in significantly different ways. Or at least they don't if they're working on a very similar, highly prescriptive type of writing assignment. The study was authored by Brian Larson, and he's an assistant professor at Georgia Tech's School of Literature, Media, and Communications. Titled Gender Genre, the Lack of Gendered Register in Texts Requiring Genre Knowledge. That was a tough one to say. The research appeared in the October issue of Written Communications, which is a quarterly peer-reviewed journal. In the study, Professor Larson analyzed approximately 200 legal memos written by first-year law students at a pair of Midwestern law schools. These students, both male and female, were given an assignment to write memoranda of law either in support of or in opposition to the dismissal or summary judgment of a claim. But typical legal
stuff, right?
Stuff. It doesn't really matter so much what exactly it was. The important takeaway here is that these are very standardized legal letters, legal notes to a court for demands, different types of things.
And it was written.
And it was written.
Okay.
And the idea was that these were very trained people, which we're going to get to here in a minute.
Okay.
The papers, when analyzed by a computer, showed...
See? Computers taking over the job.
Oh, well... Okay, you're right. You are a computer, aren't you? You can own up, Dirk. I know. You passed the Turing test already, so it's good. Well, the papers were analyzed by a computer, and they showed essentially no structural language differences between the papers written by the men and the ones written by the women. Now, as I mentioned, prior research had revealed that there are some general differences in the ways in which men and women use written communication. For example, women have been shown in the past to use more verbs describing states of mind, such as feel or realize or anticipate. Men tended to cram lots of informational language into their writings with a heavy focus on nouns, prepositions, and attributed adjectives like writing legislative intent as opposed to simply writing intent. That's interesting, and I found that to be true as well. I think in looking at writings from men and women, when I know which gender is writing to me. So the question is, why did the current research indicate little, if any, gender difference when the prior information showed that there was a significant difference? Well, Larson postulates that it has to do with the nature of this particular type of subjects and the particular type of writing that those subjects undertook in this case. These are people, again, who are very, very highly trained in very, very similar ways, and they have a strong sense of cultural norms and an even stronger desire to avoid the negative consequence of a poor grade. Remember, these were assignments for law students. They all wanted to get good grades, so they were very motivated to write in that way. So thus there was some, I guess you could call it herding together in this very similar voice, use of style and voice. In less rigid scenarios, such as social media posts, which is the example everybody uses, gender differences in written communications remain, and they're very strong. And it's in those types of writings that they were probably picked up on in the earlier studies, less formal, more informal types of writing. So one takeaway from this study is that highly trained male and female professionals in similar settings will offer written communication with little, if any, difference based on gender. Bias based on gender, which of course still does exist, we have to admit, simply has no basis in fact as a consequence. As it applies to this particular study, a brief presented by a male lawyer, for instance, versus one from a female lawyer, will be, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from one another. That's the key takeaway here, is this idea of gender bias, that there's certain tasks that a woman lawyer will be better at than a male lawyer. Is not true. There is no thing as a gender bias if people have a very prescriptive and they're very highly trained. If the assignment is very ordered culturally, aligned in that way, there's no difference. But again, socially, when you look at things like social media posts, yeah, there is a difference. Women and men do communicate differently. But in this case, they don't. And that's a really key takeaway, is that in these professional settings, bias should not exist. There really isn't such a thing as a gender difference in terms of how they communicate.
Right, and I think, just really quickly, I think something that this doesn't get into, because it's a very narrow study looking at one thing, but actually is the importance, and this has been talked about, the importance of the different style of communication between men and women. I mean, in this case, when you're submitting a legal brief, you have a specific task, but within, for instance, it's been talked about within management, there is a difference in the way men and women tend, and this has been studied, that tend to communicate, which may actually be a good thing.
A good thing, yes.
different forms of communication, each lend their own good and sometimes negative things to a situation, but that can be mined, right. and that's I think important within a management. So it's kind of a different thing, but that came to mind as you were talking.
Agreed. No,
right.
no doubt.